I want to welcome everybody to the Georgia Pecan Growers Association sort of pre-conference tour. And we're here today at Jaros Farms. And we want to thank Mike Jaros and everybody that works here on the place with him. They've been very accommodating to us over the years. And what we're going to talk about right here today is that we have a hedging study in place. And you hear me talk about in the meetings sometimes our hedging trial that we have. Well, this is it. This is where we've been doing it. They've been kind enough to pretty much give their orchard up to us for the last 8 or 9 years, since 2013, to do this sort of a long-term study here. The way we have this orchard set up for this study, we have a pretty large block in this orchard. It's divided up into both pretty much half of it's desirable, half of it's Sumner. And the way we have these plots divided up is we have a 5-row block that we hedge and a 5-row block that's not hedged. And we've replicated that over this orchard about 4 times for each of those treatments. And this is really the best way to figure out what you're doing with hedging, I think. If you're looking at hedging and you take your data from a per tree basis, you really don't get a good picture of what's happening with the trees. I think to get good information for a hedging study, you need large blocks like this. And it's kind of rare that you come upon an orchard that has the size that you can get those blocks in, with the uniformity that we have here, and also with growers that are willing to cooperate as much as these guys are. We certainly appreciate their cooperation and their help in this study. So I'm going to talk a little bit to you about some of the results we've seen from that over the years. We've looked at a lot of different things here with hedging. We've looked at, of course, yield. We've looked at percent kernel, size, water stress on the trees. We've looked at nutrition as far as leaf samples. We've even looked at hurricane damage from a few years ago when we did have a hurricane, tropical storm come through this area. So we've been able to get a lot of information about hedging that we did not previously know here in the Southeast. So I'm going to share some of that with you today. All right, this particular orchard was planted in the late 90s, and we're on about a 40 by 40 spacing, but the rows are offset. So you've got a little bit more space actually in between from one tree to the next as you go across. But the actual rows are still 40 feet apart, and the trees in the row are 40 feet apart. The way we hedge this is we come in and we hedge every other middle. So we will hedge the middles on the side and the top of those trees one year. The next year we do the alternate middles that we skipped the previous year. And then after that, the third year, we won't hedge anything, and then start back over again in the 4th year. So that kind of gives you an idea of the hedging program and the interval between the cuts that we make. What we've seen here over the years, if you're just looking at yield, we see we have not really seen a difference at all, really, a significant difference in yield, except for last year. As you know, last year was a huge crop in the state, certainly probably the largest yield we've had in this orchard since we started. And in that particular year, for the first time since we've been doing it, actually we had a statistical difference between the treatments, and it was that the non-hedged actually had a heavier yield than the hedged trees. And we've had kind of a trend for that, where it's been each year there's not a lot of difference in the yield. It's never been statistically significant until last year. But numerically, it's always been just a little bit higher in the non-hedged trees, but not very much. So it's really, you can just kind of discount any yield advantage for that. So you really don't see much difference at all most years in yield between hedged and non-hedged. What we do see is we consistently see a difference in both size and percent kernel in the hedged trees. So your quality is always going to be better in the hedged trees. One thing we started out looking when we first started this study, we started looking at water stress on the trees. And the way we measure that is with what we call a pressure bomb. We go out and we cover the leaves with foil covered bags, and that kind of brings the water pressure inside the trunk of the tree. It equalizes the water pressure in the leaf with the water pressure in the trunk of the tree. And that kind of tells you what the water stress on the tree is. So we put that foil bag on there, leave it on there for 10 or 15 minutes, cut it off, and then we put that bag into the pressure chamber with the stem of that leaf sticking out, close it all down, and then we increase the pressure inside that chamber by pumping it up. And then we look for when water starts to come out of the stem of that leaf, and then you take a reading for the pressure at that point. The higher the pressure for that, the more water stress the tree is under. And we consistently saw, when we looked at that for 3 or 4 years, that the hedge trees always were under less water stress than the non-hedge trees under the same irrigation schedule and management. And so basically what that tells you is that what's going on there is that when we hedge these trees, we keep the tree at a smaller size, so that's less tree for that root system to feed. And of course the root systems on the non-hedged and the hedge should be roughly the same because they're the same size trees or same age trees, but the hedge trees of course are smaller because we've done so much cutting on them. That allows the tree to feed what's left and feed those nuts a little better. And so that whole thing with the water stress on the tree translates into better quality and better yield because the tree can more efficiently distribute it to the nuts that it needs. Recently we've started looking more closely at what the leaf samples look like in hedged and non-hedged to try to get an idea of if there's any differences really with nutrition, if we may need to start to fertilize our hedge trees differently than our non-hedge trees. So far what we've seen some statistical differences some years, but we've not really seen anything consistent. It seems to kind of change from one year to the next in most years. Some years, you may have certain nutrients that there's no difference. Some years you'll have phosphorus may be different. Some years potassium may be different. So it's been kind of all over the board and nothing really consistent. So in that situation, we'd kind of say, well, there's no real difference there. The way you're fertilizing should be fine, but we're going to continue looking at that for another few years to come up with a better, more conclusive answer. We just kind of still in the third year or so of looking at that, and I'd be a little more comfortable with it if we had a few more years of data. The other thing that we have seen is that when you hedge the trees, of course, you're keeping them smaller size. So when you do have a significant wind event, whether it be a hurricane or tropical storm, straight line winds or whatever, that canopy of that tree is presenting less resistance to that wind. And when that happens, you tend to get less damage to the trees. I think it was Hurricane Irma that came through here several years ago. And right after the storm came through, I came up here and kind of went through the orchard, and it was obvious just driving by that there were differences in the amount of damage in the hedged blocks versus the non-hedged blocks. So I kind of went through and did some counting and looked at the number of limbs that were broken out, the number of trees down, etc. And basically what we saw with that was that the hedged trees had 60% less damage from that storm than the non-hedge trees, and that's a big difference. So there's a lot of different advantages to hedging. So there's different ways of managing the sunlight than just hedging. Of course, you can remove trees. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But there's a lot of advantages to hedging, not just your size and quality and consistency of production and all that type of stuff. There's a lot of other things that go into it, and that with the hurricane issues we've had here in the past here in the state, that becomes a pretty big incentive to hedge. Is if you can save trees by hedging them and keeping them smaller, that's going to be a good thing, and you get the additional advantages of hedging as well. We've mentioned the size and quality, the water stress, the less storm damage. You also have a situation where you can better apply chemicals to those trees. You get better coverage with your sprayer. And I know Dr. Bach is probably going to talk more about that, so I'll let him cover that, but that is another advantage you have. So we're kind of now 8 or 9 years in, we're starting to move into a different phase of this study now. In the past, we've been looking at hedged versus non-hedged on the original spacing. Well, as you can imagine, the non-hedged trees were starting to crowd, and we want to continue to have the maximum sunlight available to these trees in the orchard so we can really get a good comparison. And so now what we're going to do is start to take a look at what's the difference between hedging an orchard and actually removing trees to open up more sunlight, which I think is the bigger question when it comes to yield. I mentioned earlier all the different advantages you get to hedging, aside from just the production aspect of it. But we're going to start now looking, as I said, here where we've removed trees. They removed every other row here in the non-hedged blocks this past winter. And so we'll be able to start getting information on how the trees respond to that, and be able to compare that with hedge trees on the original spacing, and really see there what the best way to go is: hedge trees or remove trees. There's more than one way, of course, to hedge trees. You can hedge as we're doing here, where we're doing every other middle. You can also hedge every third row, every fourth row, every fifth row, and then come back and repeat that pattern every year as well. So just because we're doing it here in this particular study by doing every other middle doesn't mean that's always the only way to do it. There's other ways for it. Another thing to mention is that this has always been dormant hedging in this particular study, so we do our hedging during the winter. But there's also a case to be made for hedging during the summer. We don't have a study looking at that here at this site, but we do have a study down at Buck Paulk's orchard down near Valdosta, looking at summer hedging versus dormant hedging on both creek and caddo. And so far what we've seen there is we don't see a lot of statistical difference in yield or quality or size. The summer hedging and dormant hedging seem to be pretty equal as far as that goes. The one thing we do see that could possibly be an advantage for summer hedging is that when you make these dormant cuts, you get really long growth coming back from that. I mean, after you make a dormant cut, your shoot growth may be 4 feet long coming off of those cut branches. When you make cuts during the summer, your shoot growth is much less. You're only getting maybe 12 to 14 inches of shoot growth versus 4 feet of shoot growth. And there's an advantage to that because you won't have to come back and hedge quite as often. And normally we want to do the summer hedging before June is over. And this gives you enough time to get some growth on there that looks like in some varieties it may fruit the following year. We do see a little bit of a difference in variety as to how they respond to summer and dormant hedging in that study. The creek trees seem to respond much better than the caddo do to it with summer hedging. But we're still only in the third or fourth year of that study, and we'd like to get some more information before we really come up with a good recommendation of how to do that. But just to let you know, that is something that we're looking at, and there's a lot of different ways you can hedge, and we're just kind of showing you one way here today in this study.